I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Okay, so yeah, like you sent me an article about this concept of spoils from Egypt, which from what I could tell is like a trope that's used a lot in theology, but I had not seen it used like this. And so I think we should just start with why did, like I want to ask you, like, why did you zero in on that phrase? What brought you to the point where you found that article?
I don't know where I found the article. I think it was in some reading about Hans Urs von Balthasar that I came across the idea, and then you Google it and you go down this whole rabbit hole and you learn that like Origen talked about it a whole lot. But the idea in question is called like the spoils of Egypt, or despoiling Egypt, which is the part of the Exodus narrative from Exodus 12, where as the Israelites are finally leaving Egypt, they ask the Egyptians for silver and gold and clothing, and God makes the Egyptians favorably disposed, and so they give their goods to the Israelites, and then they take them into Canaan ultimately. And then there's a section where they say, so they plundered the Egyptians, and various church fathers, including especially Origen, use this as a kind of like typology for the church, where Christian theology can plunder the wisdom of like Greco-Roman pagan philosophy and sort of refine and redeem whatever is like true and good and beautiful in these ideas, because they're not in scripture or the explicit Christian tradition doesn't make them wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So it disposes you to be like more open towards other cultures and ideas, to see how they can be redeemed or synthesized with Christianity, if that makes sense.
Oh, it totally makes sense. Yeah, without that, you wouldn't have really Catholic theology, because so much of that was done during the Middle Ages, right? Like the plundering of the pagan philosophies as they came back online in the late Middle Ages. And
sure, but even well before then, Platonism, Stoicism, Aristotelianism.
Mm-hmm. And the assumption was always that that Christians could take what made sense and was compatible with the Bible and illuminating, as long as it was not incompatible with biblical revelation. If they had to choose between something in pagan philosophy and biblical revelation, they had to choose revelation. But a lot of times there was no clash, or the two could be reconciled.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
sure. And the reason when I came across this idea, I'm like, oh, this is something I've been thinking, or I've been kind of like looking for this concept because in my journeys through like leftist theory, when I run into various kinds of religious and especially conservative religious people, they're basically making an argument that no, we can't spoil the Egypt of like post-enlightenment modern critical theory. That these ideas are fundamentally materialistic, nihilistic, diabolical, etc., and we need nothing to do with them. But also, meanwhile, what these people usually don't know is they have more or less plundered liberalism and bourgeois theory and synthesized that with their Christianity. Now, I don't think they've done it very convincingly or coherently, but they've done it to their satisfaction so much that they think it's common sense. So
yeah, I think they haven't done it consciously, even that it's a sort of an unconscious equation of liberal ideology with Christianity. Yeah.
Right. And that might be a testament to like the central liberal anthropology that we are individuals. I mean, I think there is like a crucial truth there that does need to be never forgotten. That's true as far as it goes. Now, does that mean that like everything can just flow from consenting individuals, or we need to avoid thinking about social structures or any need for like a revolutionary reconstitution of society because everything just comes from individuals and their beliefs? Like, I don't think that follows.
Right. It's liberalism is sort of the abstracting of that one, or a few principles that there is some correlation with Christianity into the whole, right, into everything that matters. And so the social nature of human beings is discounted. The spiritual nature of human beings is discounted. So yeah, like I know the article talked about critical theory a bit, didn't get on straight up Marxism, but I think that I agree. Like, obviously, these days, a lot of Christians are trained to think of critical theory and Marxism as evil and therefore not to be engaged, period. And you're saying, I think, that runs counter to the Christian tradition and the way that Christians have in the past approached philosophy and secular thought.
Yeah, or at least how like elites within the Christian tradition have handled things.
Right. And then it trickles down, maybe.
Maybe, but maybe not. And it depends on, and I mean, liberalism is a case in point of, well, the elites have assimilated it. It has trickled down. It is people's like material social common sense. So of course it makes sense to them. And like liberal individualism has enough overlap with like a genuine Christian personalism that the two can be conflated and equivocated. And so I think that's partly how it functions for a lot of current day religious people. And my argument, to kind of briefly restate it, is that I think they have, if we imagine these as like just like crowns or jewels or treasure chests or whatever left over from like the Enlightenment, they have correctly rejected in the leftist tradition, let's say like materialism, the like authoritarian attempt to get rid of any hierarchy whatsoever, viewing a sort of trans-historical development of class struggle, and the materialism and the nihilism embedded in materialism, I think. This idea that somehow or other we can just take over the state and then it's going to sort of, through its monopoly on violence, create a new society. I think religious people, conservative or progressive, are right to like reject these things largely, if not entirely. But to me, what they're missing, and more what I take to be the core of what Marxists are talking about, is the idea that capitalist society or liberalism is abstractly dominated by capital, relations, and logic. I think that's a crucial thing that we shouldn't let go of, because that seems to be very real, even though I only vaguely understand what abstract domination is, and I would really like to learn more. But this idea that there is this logic that dominates everything we do, and it's not the outward forms of how we experience our life, it's this more inward kernel.
Right.
I think that's a crucial thing, and most people don't talk about that. And I think part of why, because it's very disturbing, because it indicates there's this like quicksilver logic that drives everything we encounter, but yet is not that. And what do you do with that? What do you do with that question? And I don't exactly know, other than you can get detached from any idea that, well, if we enact this reform or that reform, we're going to somehow or other fix our society.
Right. Yeah, the liberal ideology sells people on the idea that we are free to choose. And at the individual level, like Milton Friedman said, free to choose. And of course, but at the same time, there's these market imperatives. I just got done teaching sections of Ellen Wood's The Origins of Agrarian Capitalism, and she makes the argument that capitalism occurs actually first in the agricultural setting in England, when most peasant farmers are driven off the land in favor of tenant farmers who rent land, grow food, sell it on the marketplace, pay their rent. And this system, which was codified in law, created imperatives, meaning like literally the tenant farmers, the landowners, the customers, everybody in this process was like pretty much really coerced. Now you could say they were free to choose. You can be a tenant farmer or not. You can like choose to lose in the marketplace by selling your goods below, what you could get for them or something like that. You can choose to lose, but of course nobody's going to do that. So my point is that, we believe that we are free to choose, and that this is like the most fundamental level of human freedom, which in the Christian view, literally it's not, it's spiritual freedom. But this is one of those conflation points where, like US Christians believe that their marketplace freedom is their freedom. But in addition to that problem, there is not that freedom in reality, because as Ellen Wood says, you are driven by these imperatives, these coercive forces. Once that takes place, right, you really don't have the freedom to choose to live any way you want and to do what you want. Is this kind of like, is it the imperatives of the market that you're thinking of here? Okay.
Right. And these imperatives of the market, like Marxist concepts of them would include things like value and like circuits of labor, and the question of like, how is value constituted, and to what extent is it through like the laboring process, through what extent is it through the transactional process, to what extent is it through like commodity value. It's all very complicated, and I barely understand it, if at all. But my point is only that I have some vague sense, and it's the inner bourgeois in me. I have some sense that like these things are very important, even if we don't really understand them. They're creating the conditions for our society to even function.
Yeah.
And it is in that bubble that we are then free to choose.
Yeah. They're important. People don't understand them. And I think I'm going to say something kind of anathema here, but like people find them boring. I always point out to my, to students, like some of the most important things, the things that dominate your life, such as these market imperatives and all these things, as well as like, your access to food and water and air itself. These, talking about these things, people find boring, which is ironic. They're the very essence of life, In a capitalist society, if you don't know those mechanisms, if you don't understand how they operate, and most of us don't, then how could you possibly, act in a way to free yourself from those restrictions?
Right, which brings me to the second sort of Egyptian treasure chest from critical theory I want to do more research and talk about. First was that abstract domination question, and then the other one is the question of the revolutionary subject, which what the old left meant like the proletariat, because the idea went something like it's only the proletariat who has the motivation and the means to actually change capitalist society into a socialist society, because they're situated within the production process and they have the incentive to do so. And then by the time you get the new left, and I would argue a kind of like liberal recuperation of leftist theory, then you enter, well, we've given up on them, so what are we going to do? Who's going to be our revolutionary subject? And it's like, well, women, minorities, the third world, students, because they're not fully integrated into the system. These people are going to be the revolutionary subject because, I guess, the same reasons. And I would argue we're living in the afterbirth of that, and that seems to be clearly not going to be the case.
Oh, that they're not going to rise up
Sure. Yeah.
just because they're disgruntled by not being treated completely equally does not make them the revolutionary subject who can rise up and take a hold of the means of production.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then inculcate a new mode of production.
Right. They're not at the, well, I shouldn't say it. I was going to say, like, they're not at the heart of the means of production, especially now. Right.
Sure. Right. Hence the cultural turn of the 60s and the new left. No longer was it about controlling production. It was about controlling culture. Because so when the idea somehow or other our culture becomes the economy.
Right. So there's where we really lost our grip on the material basis of inequality.
I think, or it was certainly a market step. Yep.
Yeah.
And again, I don't exactly know what to do with this concept or how to fully Christianize it, but I think it's worth asking. The more I've delved into like more radical Christian arguments for a new society, is that it's very understandable. And so I don't want to fully discount it, but there is a marked disinterest in the idea that Christians or the church would somehow or other be the revolutionary subject. That is very much, and I get it. There are serious questions about original sin, human frailty, the extent to which the current dispensation we're living under is divided into a city of God and a city of man, church and state. But it seems to me what very few of these people are giving me the elaborate apology as to why we have to take it for granted that basically we're going to live a public life that is basically abstractly dominated by capital and the state's regulations. And then how are we not just going to live like a quietistic life in our private homes and communities? Is that good enough? And it may be that is the best we can hope for.
But I mean, part of the problem for the Christian religion right now is that if that is the best that you can hope for, it doesn't make Christianity a whole lot different than a lot of other faiths that you could choose from, as well as secular options like meditation, civic groups, service organization membership. I mean, it doesn't like stand out from that crowded field of like lifestyle options, all of which are designed to help you kind of cope with the abstract domination rather than, change it. Yeah.
Right. And I guess the defense, if I were to put in a defense for, I think the counter argument would be something like, well, the only way we know it is because, again, on the other side of this veil of life, the fruits of the various religions will show themselves to have been either efficacious or not. And there's a more moderate example of, if we closely looked at how Catholics and Orthodox that are regularly consuming valid Eucharistic or valid sacraments. We can see in these more finer ways how they're leading more exalted lives than inferior religions, let's say.
So if the main purpose of Christianity really is nothing but achieving heaven,
Mm-hmm.
then
Theosis.
that argument kind of is somewhat persuasive. And I'm not saying that isn't a part of it. It is, right? I mean, but it's, and I'm not, I'm not a biblical scholar, but it seems to me that there's quite a bit of evidence from the Gospels that it was not supposed to stop there, that you were supposed to live your life differently. You were supposed to treat other people differently.
Sure. And here's where I say, I would just ask, does that mean that in our private lives and to some degree in our public lives, do we just act like slightly more virtuous or maybe way more virtuous, normal people? Or does it mean we're supposed to link up with similar people and actively change the social, political, material conditions of our lives?
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, not to get us too far off track, but I've been watching The Chosen. Actually, I went through like the whole 2 seasons in about 2 weeks.
Okay.
I would recommend it. Anyway, it's a popular but well done like take on the disciples and Jesus as Jesus's ministry gets started and everything. And so it gives you a chance to go back and contemplate what it must have been like for these people when he comes along and says, follow me. And it means like you're going to drop your fishing business, or you're going to leave your wife or husband, or you're going to, you're going to leave your total life of like debauchery. And now everything is going to be really different, and you're going to be poor, and you're going to have to just rely on faith because Jesus ultimately will come through. It's so like challenging that it's hard to imagine people take. And one of the people that's featured in this is Nicodemus, who is asked by Jesus to like follow him. And Nicodemus knows he's talking to God. And yet ultimately he has like wealth. He's got, his sort of like rabbinic sinecure. He's got his wife. And he just, like cannot leave that life. And so at the end scene, he's like lurking around the corner. Jesus looks back to see if he's coming with him, and he knows he's not. And Jesus says, you are so close. And Nicodemus tosses a bag of gold coins for the disciples to take with them so that they at least have something. To me, that's like the type of Christian that you're talking about, is like they're more serious than the average bear, but they're not willing to like leave their comfortable place because it is a high price. So instead they throw the bag of gold at the church building or whatever the project is. Mainly it's buildings, from what I can tell, is what churches like want you to pay for. Okay, that's a bit cynical, but yeah. So like you toss the gold coins at the building or whatever, and then, you're kind of guilty about the fact that you haven't done better, but now you can go home.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, I mean, I get it, and here again, there's a serious question of to what extent then, if a higher form of discipleship, is it just going to a monastery or out into the wilderness, or is it a kind of is it the kind of image you would get from plundering Marxism, where it's like, or are we trying to build a new society? Which of these two things, or maybe both, does true faithfulness look like?
Well, I mean, to tie these things together, what I'm hearing is, if we plunder Marxism to try to understand like the structural domination of capital, then we're one step closer to actually seeing how we can get beyond it, or why it is that like actual, cooperation with each other and perhaps taking action to overturn capital at some point is necessary.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I think so. And I think, so I've been sucked down a rabbit hole in the last couple weeks. I found some sort of think tank called New Polity, and they're all about doing like what they call like post-liberal. Basically, they're about promoting Catholic social doctrine. And this, it's still early on in me looking into them. But one of the striking things about them is that once you get past this veneer that they are these radicals and they've somehow or other seen their way out of liberal theory, is that when you look at their theory of revolution, let's say, or their theory of social change, it still seems to me to be fundamentally liberal in the sense of we're going to create a bunch of good Catholic liberal subjects. And then somehow or other, these Catholic liberal subjects are going to somehow or other create a Catholic society based on distributism, subsidiarity, the common good, universal destination of goods, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't seem to have a real materialist critique of how societies work.
And without that, what you get is, we do have a lot of Catholic churches, very strong Catholic communities across the country in certain places where most of the people in any given in the town are Catholics or a strong element. We still have that in some places, but what you see is kind of like people go to church, they go, have the Roman sale once a year, or they do support the Life Choice Ministry outfit or whatever this type of thing. And they have like pints with the priest, events once a month or something like that. And there's a little bit of a panache of or a veneer of Catholic culture, but that's been around forever. That's basically like church that's a little stronger. But it's not like these Catholic communities have transitioned over to, actual more strong communities. If they are, it's because they're like in some little pocket of the country where people still know each other because, neighbors, and it's more like the neighbor angle.
Yeah. Or I would say like the material and social conditions.
Yeah, right, exactly. Of people who still are living in a place they've lived in their whole lives, know each other. But it's rare, it's rarer and rarer. And the Catholic Church isn't necessarily, or any church is not necessarily like promoting that approach to life more generally.
Sure. Right. And the irony of what I'm finding with these New Polity people, I think, and I'm not interested in critiquing them too much, other than they seem to be sympathetic or symptomatic of what I see in the rest of the culture, is that at the end of the day, there's still this idealism that somehow or other, what's going to fix this is better catechesis and indoctrination.
Right. And I'm just saying, and I checked them out. Thanks for, I didn't know about them, and they are interesting and they do make some good points. But basically what they haven't factored in is, if you think that is really the answer, let's look at the examples of people and places where that is done and ask yourself, is it the answer? Has it yielded the other things that you are aiming at? Stronger community, more cohesive, supportive community, stronger like moral behavior. Actually, it's been a while since I looked, but I think it's kind of a truism that, for instance, divorce rates are no different between like Catholic or like fairly like strong Protestant Christians and the general population, for instance. So there's no necessary like spillover effect just from getting your doctrine right and doing a little bit more in the way of your, Catholic focal lens.
And I would raise the question of to what extent is that because these society, or whether, irregardless of your religion, are you abstractly dominated by capital? Are you intellectually dominated by liberalism? And therefore, how different are you from the outside world?
Right.
Another example I wanted to briefly highlight. We've talked over the years about the Benedict Option, that book by Rod Dreher.
Yeah.
And I wanted to read a quick section because he has in there, you would think this whole book, which is about, okay, like mainstream society is on a path to destruction, especially because, the most glaring issue is left liberal woke culture is killing all the babies and normalizing transgenderism. So what we need, the Benedict Option, is communities need to embrace a kind of light Benedictine monasticism. And here's why I think it's interesting. More than that, there is this first step among a Christian right liberal to try and articulate, okay, what would a new society look like? How would we build a new society within the shell of the old? Is the potential offered by this book. And it's been a few years since I read it, but I remember my takeaway was, well, nothing really. in terms of asking the questions that we've been asking, there is no answer. But I wanted to read this section. It's called "Rediscover the Trades."
Okay.
And he writes, for some Christians, this is on page 190 if anybody has the Kindle edition or the book. Rod Dreher writes, for some Christians, the transition from mainstream society will be as radical as the one Brother Francis made, shifting from working with one's mind to working with one's hands. And it might be more spiritually profitable too. Sam McDonald is a Catholic who oversees the parochial school system in rural Elk County, Pennsylvania, 2 hours northeast of Pittsburgh. Though the county is not the industrial powerhouse it once was, there are still significant manufacturers there. Elk County, population 31,479, is heavily Catholic and culturally conservative. MacDonald, a son of Elk County, was one of the good students encouraged by the culture to leave and make his way in the outside world. After earning a Yale degree in the mid-1990s and working as a journalist in Washington, D.C., he eventually returned with his wife and kids. Today, he is an education innovator, working to introduce some of the county's Catholic schools to the classical model, which is when they try and give you a classical liberal arts education.
Right.
Quote, I'm going to have a classical academy that builds die setters. That's where we're headed, he says. If you go back 50 years, the Catholic kids around here were all taught by nuns. They were all die setters who learned Latin and who could do trigonometry like nobody's business, unquote. If you have a strong work ethic, can pass a drug test, and can be trusted to show up on time, Elk County has a job for you. Its local manufacturers know that within 10 years, they will need 10,000 workers to replace the skilled laborers who are retiring. Too many of the current county residents who would normally fill those jobs are too dysfunctional to do them or have moved away. Rather than look at relocating the factories a decade from now, the Elk County industrialists are considering a campaign to draw good workers to the area. Quote, they want to hire and build up a workforce of citizen workers, says McDonald, people who are not only going to be reliable employees, but who are also going to be good citizens who go to church and who get involved with the community, unquote. McDonald says that there's already a good basis for a Catholic Benedict Option community there. There are plenty of churches, a great Catholic school system that's improving, and a culturally conservative ethos that's family friendly. Plus, it's affordable. You can get a good house for around $60,000, which is not much more than many skilled laborers make in a year. The catch is that you have to work in a factory, though that's a much more appealing alternative these days than in decades past when factories were grimy. And he leaves out way less automated. Mm-hmm. But anyway, and you have to live in a place McDonald's describes as, quote, in the middle of nowhere, unquote. It's a matter of priorities. That's Dreher's comment. And then he goes into another quote. If you're in a place in your life where you decide that you can't work for your company because you can't be an ally, by which he means to the queer, LGBT, whatever cause, Elk County might make sense, he says. Nobody's going to ask a die setter to be an ally. They don't care. unquote. Tradition-minded Christians who have immersed themselves in the writings of Wendell Berry should understand that agrarianism is no panacea. Quote, you can't make a living as a farmer, but you can make a living as a die setter, says MacDonald. Industrialism is the new agrarianism. It's not back to the land, but back to the trades, unquote. The challenge for some Benedict option Christians will be to find and relocate to the elk counties all over America, far away places on the margins of the empire. Funny thing is, the margins of the empire could be as near as the boundaries of what is acceptable employment in one's social class. Faithful Christians who foresaw a professional career for themselves or their children will need to give the trades a second look. Better to be a plumber with a clean conscience than a corporate lawyer with a compromised one. And
Oh.
and why this section always stuck with me is he's rejecting, like, look, we're not going to worry about the abstract domination of capital. That is settled.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not going to worry about being revolutionary subjects. That is settled, that we are not going to challenge the abstract domination of capitalism. And we are not going to shoot for any kind of revolutionary reconstitution of society. We are going to step away from the upper class jobs that are dominated by cultural liberalism so that we can lead right liberal lives in small towns, and we can set up machines so that they will run, and we can get our little dividends on being the working class. And then you can go to your Catholic church and be a member of community, whatever exactly that means in this context. And it is, what does he say? It's a matter of priorities.
Mm-hmm. So take your, low wage and like it. I mean, there's several things I hear here. One is we're just all going to be good boys and girls.
Yeah.
And we're going to stay here and do this work, and we're going to be grateful for it, and so we're going to, we're just going to kind of serve the capitalist master, first of all.
Yeah.
And then secondly, there's the commentary about the allies, and I won't belabor this, but I do think that they're just really paranoid about gay people. And there is a point where, I mean, the ally concept, even though it's somewhat PC, is simply can boil down to, I will be your friend if you have a person in my community who is somewhat unpopular. I think that's actually a fairly close to Christian position. So I don't appreciate the, sort of belittling or I don't know, just this sort of lens on, or, focus on one or two things, one of which is homosexuality, as though the world is coming apart primarily because gay people exist. Holy cow. If only it were so, right? If that was the extent of the issues that we've got. So and they're running away from the fact that your little die setting company, as soon as, it's cheaper, despite the fact that you're all good little boys and girls who are keeping your heads down and going to church and doing your job for a little wage, no matter what, when it gets cheaper to do that in China, or they can completely automate it, guess what? They aren't going to need you anymore. And so there is kind of though they're accepting the power of capital, they're also in denial about its power, as though they can kind of harness it by, we'll just all go to one little town. We'll be such good people that they won't ever want to leave. We'll have to keep pleasing them, but we can do that. Sure. That's not how it works. That's the biggest problem we've got.
But I think there again, this is partly what you can't see when you don't have some sense of the abstract domination of capital, because then you're like, oh, well, the industrialists in the area are trying to attract people instead of moving. And it misses the real tragedy of modernity is that, or one of them is that, capital actually isn't good for the industrialists at the end of the day, that they too get stabbed in the back, not just the workers, because eventually it's going to be cheaper.
Yes. Just want to make,
for them to sell out or go under because of competition.
Right, right. Almost everybody ends up getting stabbed in the back at some point in the system. And notice that, in order for this to work, all these traditional types have to go to these towns. So they got to leave their connections that they've probably barely made wherever they came from. They probably already left their family and extended family to like pursue careers. Because that's what, this is one of the bigger consequences of capitalism, is that it just breaks up communities and families. And now they're going to choose to live here for this reason, so start over again.
Sure.
And yeah.
Right. And his idea that so just because you're a die setter and you don't have to affirm your cubicle mate's gender identity, does this mean your conscience is clean? What are you setting the dies for? What are you making? Who's buying them?
Right. Good point. Are you going to object if it's I don't even know what a die setter is. Does it have to do with printing? I assume it does.
My understanding is like die setting is like setting up machines to run for whatever like specific tasks that they work for, which usually involves printing out like plastic or metal parts.
Gotcha. Okay. So they could be making anything.
Yeah.
So, like, are they going to object?
Think of all the devilish toys they could be putting together.
You could be making, dildos, for instance. Like, maybe. I don't know.
Well, better warheads than dildos.
Okay. Unfortunately, I think they might agree, but I don't know.
I think they will. A lot of them would, because this is where this logic gets you.
I'm afraid so. So, I think it's like a real defeatist, kind of nostalgic, and ultimately kind of stupid, retreat that is being proposed here. And I'm trying not to be rude, but it just is, it's like way too late. But then I think part of the concept literally is we're just trying to survive, and we'll create these pockets of kind of moral rectitude that will hopefully outlast the cataclysm that's going to happen. And then we'll kind of like reestablish larger Christian community after all of this implodes somehow.
Right. Which is the conservative Christians version of like the insane techno-capitalists that want to go to Mars to build a new society. The idea is still us virtuous people are going to somehow or other build a better society in a hypothetical future, while we default on the responsibility to build one now, here.
So you're saying they're the Elon Musks of Christianity?
In that sense, yes. By presuming that, one, they are superior. Now, in the conservative Christians' case, it's because they have a correct Christian metaphysics and virtue ethics. And then in the case of Musk and them, it's because they have money and technocracy behind them. But I think you can draw this, they have a convergent mentality, which is, well, in the present, I get to be a patient and sort of just passively wait and maybe batten down the hatches. And then at some point in the future, when something radically shifts things up, then I'm going to be an agent who actually takes hold of the situation.
Right. Yeah. When things open up and I can, but right now, all I can do is kind of just survive and protect, kind of like batten down the hatches. And
right. Because there's just a dust bowl coming at us. And what are we going to do?
Right.
Let's shove some towels under the windows to keep as much of this dust outside as possible.
And it's just so like, they walk right up to the edge. These kinds of folks in Christianity walk right up to the edge of a critique, a fairly thoroughgoing critique of liberal capitalism, and then they back off. Like they do get that liberalism has like created some of the moral problems that they see. They don't really, fix their eyes on the capitalist part, the part of like material structural domination of capital. But they do deal with the fact that liberalism has like churned things up and has kind of created all sorts of like moral chaos in the universe. And that it's disappointing. It's like refreshing on the one hand to see people even try to like think beyond the current system, but it's also disappointing because in their critique, they shrink back into the tropes that are thoroughly available even without that critique, of a sort of very traditional conservative vein, as though, if we could just educate our kids with classical, like a classical education and teach them Latin, we can keep them down on the farm or something like that.
Right. And then, your great grandchildren who is good at trigonometry and Latin and knows how to set the dies is going to like resurrect throne and altar in America.
You know what? These kids are smart. I've run across many of them that have been educated this way. And believe me, they don't want to go set dies. Okay. They don't, because they're like smarter than your average bear. So they tend to go to a university and then they get ideas about being a lawyer or a professor or something like that, actually, a CEO.
Sure.
Because it is a good education.
Yeah,
but it
sure.
you don't want to go back and die set. Okay. So, well, we better wrap up for today. Do you want to plunder Egypt on behalf of all Christians?
I suppose. Yeah. I know they're all waiting with bated breath.
Oh yeah, like somebody has to do it. And once they find out it's us, they'll come flocking to the podcast. But yeah, I think that we're like brave enough to go there and to find out what we can keep. In fact, we've been doing that, but I think in this podcast, we can, moving forward, talk quite a bit about like what from Marxist and critical theory we can take and use as Christians instead of just being afraid of the whole ball of wax as evil.
Is it brave or is it stupid?
Probably both. Doesn't have to be one or the other. Could be both. But, like in the name of free intellectual inquiry, there should be no, you shouldn't just say right off the bat, this area of thought is off limits, because that's a position of weakness, first of all, because it says I'm afraid of that, right? Like, I'm not sure my argument can withstand the onslaught of that. So I'm going to just stay away from it like I would, metaphysical evil.
Right. Yeah, I have a whole, it's not just my theory. A lot of other people have said it like obliquely, and I'm kind of extrapolating it. But I think part of what's happening at like all levels of society is that we're in a crisis of liberalism, and various groups are making like qualified retreats from various liberal ideals. And one of them is the idea that we should just have a free and open inquiry into ideas. Some people are like, no, we're going to be platforming bad ideas, or we need the state and or the school administration to restrict ideas. Right. That's one way we're doing it. And then what's so problematic of that is then you have like people that think it's very profound for them to just stand up for these classical liberal ideals, as if that itself is like super revolutionary, is going to solve all our problems. Mm-hmm. Instead of like, we're just tracking a collective decline from liberal standards.
Yeah, well, it becomes almost reactionary because you're reacting against those forces of, that you just mentioned, that are either woke or they're like super conservative, mm-hmm. and want to limit people's options. And you're saying 3 cheers for free speech, but of course that doesn't go anywhere anyway.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because partly the abstract domination of capital necessitating intellectual and cultural decline in the long run says we can't afford that luxury of free and open inquiry. Go set up the die set, dude.
Yeah, right. Get to work. Keep your head down. Shut up. And read your newsletter on the weekend, yeah. Of course, our podcast could be that newsletter. So one thing I want to make clear is we don't want anybody to go away feeling good after listening to one of our podcasts, as though, all of your like issues, guilt, and feelings of trepidation and conflict are resolved because you've gotten your injection from us. Because I think that's the way a lot of these outlets function psychologically for people, is that it makes them sort of feel like, okay, I've got that part of my life squared away. I've got some direction. I can just listen to these people. And we want you to listen to us, but we don't want to and won't present this neat, tidy answer for you in a well-packaged format that makes you feel good. I think that's
right. Yeah, you should take these ideas, go clean your room, and then go organize your community.
Right. Don't just stop with cleaning your room. Although, if you can't get your ass out of the chair, that's the first step for sure.
The IDW people are right. You should clean your room first. That's true.
Absolutely. Yeah. Or to put it better, like, if you can't clean your room, what else can't you do?
Clean your room, try and get a garden, try and make some friends, try and make a union.
Yeah. One step follows from the other. But it's not all about you. It's not all about your psychological comfort. It's not all about, feeling good. We're not going to replicate church in this way. We're not going to have people go away feeling better, because in order to get anything done, you have to feel kind of bad. You have to feel like something is wrong. You have to feel like you haven't done very much and you ought to do something more.
Yeah. And very quickly, these more abstract questions about the abstract domination of capital would become clear when you see that past a certain point, even basic transformations of your own life and certainly your communities are not allowed for by capital.
Right.
Like, very quickly, you will find the limit of what is possible.
You're not free to choose, as a matter of fact. Yeah. That's the dirty secret that's hidden from view underneath all of our consumer activity.
Right. And that's why we need the swirling dust bowl of all of these stupid arguments in which both sides are right and then in a wider sense wrong.
Yeah. Well, this show is kind of like either an air filter or a laxative, depending upon your metaphor. All right. Well, why don't we, any parting thoughts before we go?
No, I'm trying to figure out a rhyme, like when you're climbing up a ladder and you feel something splatter, diarrhea. Like what our version of that when you're trying to learn about the abstract domination of capital and you're
Yeah, that's a tough one. I thought of crap it all, but I don't think that it really fits with the sentiment.